All right, so in the last lecture, I asked you to think about some things about the way the social world is gendered. And something that you might have thought of was jobs. And jobs and money are what we're going to talk about in this lesson. So this is our gender wage gap lesson. We have lots of learning outcomes today that kind of coincide with each part of the lecture. So first of all, students will be able to examine occupational data to explore the gender wage gap. Students will be able to summarize ideas for why the wage gap exists. Students will be able to define occupational gender segregation. That's going to be really important here. And then kind of to consider kind of a big question to consider through all this and at the last part of the lecture, what are the structures involved and how do they constrain and enable agency? As you might have picked up on, that's a theme for our whole semester. All right, so first of all, I want to talk about, before we start, our first part here is going to be an activity, but I want to talk a little bit more about education. So coming back to education, we talked about this in the stratification unit and how the more education you have, the more it pays off in terms of lifetime earnings. And so, the questions that I asked you last unit were things like, is education the great equalizer? Education does make a difference. So what this is showing you here, this is out of, this is looking at estimated lifetime earnings in millions of dollars. And so they're including here, the red bars represent some controls that they used here. So what they're showing is the difference here in estimated lifetime earnings by education, but also by gender. So they're looking at men's earnings and women's earnings. And what I hope is pretty obvious here is how much lower women's earnings are than men's, that education is paying off much better for the men. Here's another way to visualize this. I'm going to pop out of the screen here really quick. So another way to visualize this is looking at it arranged differently. And what this chart is showing that women are making less at every level of education than men do. That other chart showed that as well. And that women's median lifetime earnings are more similar to men a couple steps down the education ladder. So this idea of women have to have a PhD to make as much as men with a bachelor's, and men with some college but no degree are earning about the same as women with a bachelor's degree. So education pays off, but it pays off a lot better for men. All right, so part one here, the wage gap. All right, so overall, based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics earnings data, we see that looking at the aggregate, at all the folks in the United States, all the women, all the men, all the jobs just bunched together, that on average, women earn 82 cents for every dollar that men make. And those are out of all the workers. It's not like they're including the people who make zero. And so that's, those are the current numbers here. In terms of the workforce, the overall workforce in the United States, women make up 44.4% of the workers and men make up 55.6% of the workers. So there are more men workers than women workers. But what about when men and women are doing the same job? Do we still see the gap? Because remember that first number, women earn 82 cents on the dollar. That's all the jobs lumped together, all the jobs lumped together. So what about when we look at the same job? What are the differences there? So this is where you all come in your activity. First review, we're going to first review the activity instructions, and then you can do it and report your findings on Sakai. So go to this website here. It's the most current Bureau of Labor Statistics wage data by gender. So this is what you're going to be seeing when we go there. So it's based on the current population survey. These numbers represent the median weekly earnings. So median, remember, means middle in terms of those different averages that you can come up with, of full-time wage and salary workers by occupation and sex in 2019. And so it's not annual earnings, it's weekly earnings. If you want to think about annual earnings, just take whatever the number is and multiply it by 52. And then keep in mind too, this is full-time wage workers. And so what we know is that part-time laborers, they are in a less stable condition. They have less prestige at their jobs. They have less job stability. So these are like the best case scenario, folks. Keep in mind too that the numbers that you're looking at, like the numbers of workers, are in thousands and not just those numbers. So in the first few rows, when you pull up this website, one of the titles is legislators, and it says 14. So there's not 14 legislators in the United States. There's 14,000 legislators. All right, so your task here, I want you to first think, what do you want to be when you grow up? So using your computer's find feature, and like I said, I'll just show you this in just a minute. On Windows, it's Control Find. I know it's different in Macs. Type in a job, but you're going to need to try some different words, and also data on your specific job might not be available. And so you might have to go with maybe a job that, maybe your specific job that what you want to be when you grow up isn't there. Maybe find one of your parents' jobs, maybe a friend, what your friend wants to be. Your job has to have numbers in the entire row. When you find it, you can't have any little dashes there in order to complete the activity. All right, so here's the example of what you'll find when you go to that link. Here's the data here. Like I said, here's those legislators. If there's not 14 of them, there's 14,000. When you get to this chart, you'll see there's a lot of things here. So you don't want to just be reading them. That's why you want to use the find feature. So if I go to Control Find, and I want to be a teacher when I grow up, right? So that's what I am. And so it's got here, it takes me to kind of the teacher section here. So it's under this education, training, and library occupations. Let's see if that's under even a larger category, professional and related occupations here. So let me scroll back down. So I am a post-secondary teacher, and so this would be my row that I would look at. And luckily, there's numbers in my entire row here. If you see down here where there's those dashes, so unfortunately, if you want to be a library technician, there's not enough data to do this activity, so you're going to have to pick a different job. I'm sorry about that. All right, so you're here, and you're like, well, what does that mean? Because all the titles are all the way at the top. So let me show you what you're looking at. So you're going to want to make sure that you write down everything from that row. So here's what the row represents. The first thing is the occupation, then the total workers, median weekly earnings for all the workers. Then we've got the men workers, men's median weekly earnings, women workers, the number, and women median weekly earnings. Again, the number of men and women and total workers are in thousands, but you can keep them just as they are here. The percentages will still be the same. So copy down this information from your chosen job, and then do some calculations. Let's do math. So calculate the ratio of women's earnings to men's by dividing women's median weekly earnings by men's median weekly earnings. So that number represents how much women make for every $1 that men make. So take that, whatever number you got here for women's weekly earnings divided by men's weekly earnings. The second calculation I want you to do is the percent of women workers in the job. Take the number of women workers and divide it by, over here, the total number of workers, and then multiply it by 100 to get a percent. All right, so there'll be a link in Sakai. This is our mini activity. And so report that data, and it'll be down under task 4. And then I'll generate a summary just so we can see like what folks came up with and report that next week. So go to the activity link in Sakai, report your occupation title, the ratio of women's earnings to men, and the percent of women workers in the field. And then there's 2 questions that I want you to answer. First of all, why do you think there's a difference between men and women's earnings in this job? Remember, this is one job that you're looking at. And so this number, it will represent the gender wage gap for this job. And then why do you think there's a difference between the percent of men and women in this job? This represents occupational gender segregation. And we're going to talk about both of those things in the following parts of the lecture. And then before we go on here, just a little bit of data to show you here. So this is a graph of all those numbers there, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the jobs and stuff. So the dots that are on this side of the line represent jobs where women make more than men. This is based on 2018 data. And then you can see the majority of dots here under the line. This is where men are making, the jobs where men are making more than women. So women do make more money than men in a few fields. However, we see that more concentrated down here, which is the lower paid fields. So the gap between men and women's earnings is usually bigger in jobs that are more highly paid. So as the further the dots are getting away from this line, means that gap between what men and women are making is going to be bigger. And we can see that those dots are getting further away from the line up here. If you go to the link, I provided the link to this chart in the PowerPoint, in the notes section of the PowerPoint, and this is actually an interactive graph. You can scroll over and see what job each of those dots represent. And then, but some good news here. The wage gap has improved over time. So when we look at data from 1979, women's earnings were only 62% of men's. So for every dollar that men made, women were only making 62 cents. And now they're making 82 cents, which is a great improvement. It's a huge improvement. But that number has really been stagnant over in the last couple decades. We haven't seen it move very much. So this is the end of part 1. So do the activity and then go on to part 2.